Okay, good morning, guys. Are you able to hear me? Good. Okay. So, I think this, welcome to the Rank Booster series of lectures or sessions that we're going to have next few weeks till the CLAT exam as such. We are going to have these sessions, and I think you might have heard about, understood what we are going to do. Every Sunday, there's going to be a mock, and the rest of the week, we are going to have a discussion on the mock itself. So the session minimum duration is going to be about 1 hour, and depends section by section, depending on your doubts, depending on the level of difficulty of the paper, or if there's scope for or need for more discussion, then we will have more discussion. And if there's any topic that you any aspect in the paper or any particular area where you're getting a little stuck up and you can ask your doubts also. This is the best time to do that. So that's the focus of these sessions. The whole goal is for you to move from your current level of your ranks and your score to a higher level. With every mock, you should see an increase now. And if you're not seeing an increase, that means you're not doing your preparation right. Something is going wrong. You're not doing enough analysis. Because here we are going to help you do the analysis of the mock also. What you should have done, what you should have left, maybe what was actually easy but you did not take it up, and what is difficult and you tried doing it and you lost time. So this is a time for you to analyze all those things. Unless you analyze those things, just doing mock day in and day out, if you do n number of mocks, it's not going to help. At the same time, you have to do mocks, because unless you do mocks, you don't know where you are. So it's both ways. It's important. Doing mocks is important. Doing mocks without analysis serves no purpose. So is that right? Okay. Yes. Now, so this set of students who are joining this session today are a mix of multiple batches. So earlier, if we had two sets of batches that were having classes in parallel, and that's why, yes, some of you have not seen me for a long time, because I've been doing legal reasoning for the advanced batch, and the regular batches were being handled by Pallavi ma'am. So legal analysis, it will be mostly between the two of us. I might do most of the sessions. Once in a while, you might also see Pallavi in these sessions. Okay. So yes, welcome to the class, all those of you who have seen me after a long time. Now, before we get started, how many of you actually did not take the mock yesterday? Did not take. Can I understand the reasons why people, I also want to understand why mocks have not been taken. What is the reason for not taking the mock? What time was the exam? Was it a single time, or was it left to people to do it? So 10 to 12, no excuse for not taking the mock. You're free after 1. Till morning 6 o'clock, you were free. Right? So whatever it is, you might have another exam, no doubt about it. But if you want to get benefit of these sessions, unless you take the mock, you're not going to get any benefit out of it. So you have to, assuming you have a mock and you take it in the morning, or even if, let's say, even if you have taken a mock from 2 to 4 or a 3 to 5, what stopped you from taking a mock, say, 9 o'clock in the night, 9 to 11? Right? So you need to plan your time and take it at some point or the other. Okay, so don't try somebody having an internet connection can be a one-off issue, and I fail to believe that the entire 24 hours there was no internet connection. So definitely some people might have these kind of issues, but try and avoid missing out the mock entirely, because what happens then is you might do a mock on a different date later and all that, but then you don't get the same benefit as you do it along with the others. Okay, so there are some benefits of doing it together. And of course, now our discussion today is going to be based entirely on how did you do the mock and what sections you have done and what you have not done and things like that. So that kind of analysis will not be of much relevance to you if you have not taken the mock. Okay, so let's not worry about it. Now, those who have taken the mock, how did you feel it? How was the mock? Average. It's not too easy, not too difficult. Yes. Did you get to see your scores? Did you get to see your scores? No. So let me tell you, the highest is 91. 91.75 is the highest, that is Anjali, and the second is Aman Chaudhary, 91.25. Okay, so legal was a bit difficult. Okay, you found legal difficult. Now coming back to the legal, a quick analysis. What were the quick analysis of what were the passages like? Okay, what was it about? So let me do one thing. Let me also open up the mock. I think the mock is probably available to you in your e-learning. The PDF is available. PDF is available to you, right, over there. And I will also be, yes, in the ebooks it's going to be available as a PDF. We are not going to be circulating these mocks. Okay, so I'm also sharing this here for you to discuss, so that will be easy for us to discuss. Now, the first passage was about reservations in jobs. Okay, now I've seen that around majority of people, a more number of, or let me say this, in the entire legal section, I can say the average number of people who have attempted most questions would be something around 50%, around 45% to 50% students have attempted most of the questions. Like for instance, for each question, if I see the percentage of people who have attempted the question, it's somewhere between 45 to 50, and of course in some questions it's a little more also. And out of the more ones, I see a lot more in the first passage. So does it also happen for a lot of people that you start off, you do the first section and then you move on to the next section after the first two? Does that kind of a thing happen? I can see that trend. A lot of people see the first two sections and don't even see the next few questions. They just move on to, either they don't have enough time, or they are put off, or whatever happens, move on to the next section. So please don't do that unless you set aside 30 to 35 minutes, and the 35 minutes is up, and that is the reason why you had moved on to the next section. Ensure that you spend at least 35 minutes for the legal section. Is that clear? The next question I have, are you attempting questions in the, okay, let's, even within the legal sections, are you attempting all the passages in the same sequence in which they appear? I can see that trend in a lot of people. That is the reason, that is another reason why what will happen is after doing the first two or three, you move on. Well, the question is not will it need more than 35 minutes per section? The question is, you need to stop after 35 minutes. Okay, agreed. Your time limit is not going to be more than 2 hours. So the time that you get per section is fixed, except for a small variation here or there. A 5 minutes more in one section and a 5 minutes then would have to be lessened in another section. That kind of thing is possible. But other than that, you are going to get a fixed time for all sections. That's not going to change per mock. Okay. So if you tell me that, each section takes more than 35 minutes, that's always going to be there. So that cannot be an excuse. You need to see what you will attempt in those 35 minutes. Okay. And yes, exactly. I was coming to that. The last passages are easier than the first passage. A lot of time that happens, that if you have, say, you had 7 passages. In fact, if you see, let's see, this is the first passage, is the reservations passage, the passage on the reservations in the thing. And then you have another passage, the second passage that comes, which is based on the temple entry. The third passage, is on the occupier liability, which is nothing but your negligence kind of thing, or giving the due care, standard of care kind of thing. And then you had about the no pregnancy clause, which was the fourth one. You had the arbitration passage, and followed by the no pregnancy clause, and then you had the joint liability, and then about the migrants. Now, if you see, which one did you find the easiest? Which passage did you find the easiest one? Joint liability? From a question setter's perspective, the easiest one was the occupier liability one, because it had 5 easy questions and 1 medium question. Okay. And then, of course, the next one would have been probably the one about the arbitrary one, the arbitration clause passage. And of course, your, the joint liability and the migrants also was an easy one. We had a lot of easy questions in those mocks. So NPC also was easy, yes. So definitely what happens is, as you go, don't always go in a sequence. Try and see what the passage is all about. Don't try and read in detail before you decide, but just do a quick look before you decide which one to do and which one to leave. Now, if you ask me which are the ones that could have been left, temples looks easy, and I think somebody also said that they felt it was easy, but actually the questions are a little tricky in that. And now it's also a question of, did you get them right or not? Did you get that passage questions? What was your accuracy? Now, you all know, right, when you see your report, when you do an analysis of your of the mock, you can actually see which question, what was the accuracy, what was your attempt percentage, and or rather, apart from your performance, you'll also get to see who all or what percent of people attempted that question and what was the accuracy rate of that particular question. You know that you're able to. Have you all gone through those kind of an analysis? Okay. Good. So let's get started with the passage itself. Let's do. So Ideally, as I said, you could have done some of the joint liability, migrants, no pregnancy, occupier liability, and then come to the first and the second passages. So that way you would have actually uh, improved your scores a bit. Now coming to I think the topper, uh, topper has got 19.5. I think you also get this kind of a report, right? The topper has got a score of 19.5, and the sectional topper actually got 22.25, whereas the band 1 score is around 27. So definitely there's a lot of scope for having done better. Okay, that is one thing that I want to say. Second thing is that I want to say is, what is important is that your accuracy is higher, not that all questions have been attempted, because what I do see is that toppers have attempted. There are quite a few people, who have got very decent scores or good scores, where your attempts have been 100% but your accuracy has been less. So your attempt being above 95% is not critical issue, but what is more important is your accuracy has to be higher, and you might have actually got a lesser score because your attempts are higher and you've got wrong. So unless you are in this context, I would like to say that Aman has got a very good accuracy compared to a lot of others, like 84% of attempts, which means around 31 questions attempted out of 37, and 24 have been right with a score of 22.5. So if you see, that's a good uh, score, or I would say good accuracy. Now what is important is that to improve the speed at which and get more right. That is important. Obviously, yes, Pragnya, you perform. What happens is, in the class you don't have that mental stress of time. Okay, so what happens is, when you're doing an exam, then you also have, in addition to having your working on the concepts and all that, you do have some amount of stress that comes in because of the pressure of the exam, and your will I do it right kind of thing, which is not there in a class. So that is normal. However, you need to see that it reduces, and that will only reduce when you lose the fear of failure. Try to overcome the fear of failure. What happens if it goes wrong? What happens if you get less? So that, let that not bog you down, let that not bother you. Once that bothers you, that's when you will have difficulties. Okay, so let's get started with the passage itself. Now the first question, do you need time to go through it? Quickly go through it, because I know that it's not possible to remember offhand the entire passage. So just do a quick review of that passage for those of you already seen it, and those of you have not seen it also, I cannot really give you too much time. So spend 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes going through this, and then we'll discuss the questions. Okay. Now let's look at the first question. GHMC, a government owned entity. Now, so this entire passage is about reservation in jobs and, how some, in which court, in Uttarakhand High Court, state government has told them to implement the reservations and all that. Then the petition has been filed by the government. High Court made some observations, and then on top of that, Supreme Court made some observations, and then there was a whether a writ of mandamus can be granted or not. That has been discussed, and now, and some statements have been made by the Supreme Court. I think what is relevant is this particular thing is a little relevant, so I'll just read this part out. The Supreme Court is not wrong in saying that a writ of mandamus cannot be granted by any court in order to enforce an enabling provision. Okay. The writ of mandamus is issued only to compel a state authority to discharge. So when is a mandamus issued? To compel a state authority to discharge a binding duty. So High Court was wrong in directing state government to collect data in order to decide on the issue of reservation. However, Supreme Court erred in its declaration. So author is not agreeing with Supreme Court in what the government does not have to show any kind of justification in deciding not to implement reservation. So this is a double negative over here, which means the Supreme Court should show justification if it is deciding not to implement reservation. To interpret the obligations of the state purely from the textual foundations of Article 16, which reads equality of opportunity, is not an appropriate approach. Fundamental rights are not isolated provisions, and they ought to be looked as an interconnected whole. It is a settled principle of law that a discretionary power cannot be exercised in a capricious manner. Simply because the exercise of power is optional for the government does not mean that it can be exercised in a whimsical manner. What does this statement mean? Can anybody summarize that for me? That what last sentence, what last two sentences, what do they mean? Now, what do you mean by discretionary power? Discretionary power means the government has, they can use their discretion. It is not binding on them. Okay. Discretionary power is they have the power to do based, yes, what they feel is right. Use their discretion. If they think it is required, do it. If they think it is not required, not do it. That kind of thing is called a discretionary power. It is not absolute. That means it's not binding that they have to do it in this way only. It is left to the discretion of the government. So when that kind of a thing is there, it cannot be done in a capricious manner, capricious or whimsical. मन मर्जी, जब मर्जी में आया किया, जब मर्जी नहीं है तो नहीं किया. That is not random. It cannot be based on whims or fancy. It has to be based on, the discretion is to be based on some logic, some quantifiable data which the government has got. That is what the entire earlier passage, that was what earlier paragraphs, that was what is being discussed. So if the government decides to do something or decides not to do something, in this context it's about reservations, decides to give reservations or decides not to give reservation, it has to be based on a quantifiable data, not based on whims and fancies. And that is the meaning of this particular, the last two sentences. Okay. Why this is important is because you have questions based on that. That's the reason why I had to bring that out. Now let's look at the questions. 69 actually we have categorized as a medium question, and I will also tell you that more than 70% have got it right, all of those who have attempted. GHMC, a government entity, is obligated to take action when when a resident in the limits complains about potholes, irrespective of their proportions. Kanchana, resident of the limits of GHMC, approaches GHMC, requests them to fill up the pothole, but after examining the complaint, the corporation found the pothole was at the edge of the road. So because it is small, they said they will not do it. Then she went to the High Court and filed a writ of mandamus saying that they have to, getting an order from the court that they need to fill up the potholes. Now, will the court issue the mandamus or not? To answer this, just let's look at when is an mandamus issued to compel a state authority to discharge a binding duty. Is it a binding duty of GHMC to fill potholes? Yes, because it is a mandatory thing for them to do their job. That is the reason why the court will say yes. They can't deny saying that, it is small and all those things, that they cannot say. So court will grant the mandamus. Option B is your answer. And I would say more than 70% have got it right, which is good. The next question, 70. The government of Telangana passed amendments to an act which granted 20% more reservation to a certain backward class, here, thereby making only 34% of positions in government entity open for everyone without giving any statistics. Kamal, who missed the job by whisker in government entity, challenged the act in the concerned court. Which of the following is the likely output? So without citing any statistics, if they do it, High Court has already struck it down saying that, they cannot do it without giving justification. So C is your answer. Not much scope for discussion. I'm moving on to the next question. Organization for Upliftment of National Backward Classes, an NGO, collected data on the representation of the backward classes with a reputed international statistics firm and submitted the data to the government, demanded that the government expand reservation even more to increase representation of the backward classes. The government refuses to implement their suggestions and ONBC moves to the court for mandamus. Then what is likely to happen? This organization this NGO has collected data and said that they need more reservations. The government refuses to implement. Can they refuse? And can the court force them to do it? Lot of the accuracy rate for this particular question was less than 20%. Most people got it wrong. Okay. Here, the answer is actually B. The government will win the case. Government has no obligation to do it. Why? There is quantifiable data. But who has collected that quantifiable data? It is this organization. So the court also has directed that the government should collect the data and based on that data, they can take decision. Okay. No, the issue is not about whether the government is obligated to act or not. Here the question is, it's not arbitrary because the data has been the quantifiable data based on which they are asking for this has not been collected by the government. So the court has clearly said that, I think in the the Supreme Court, see, though here the court has said that it has to be done by the data, it is a well settled that without in-house quantifiable data showing inadequate representation, government cannot grant reservation. Which means in-house means it has to be collected by the government. It cannot be, if it's collected by outside source, that cannot be used to decide the reservation. What is the sanctity of that data? Unless the government themselves collect that data, they cannot use it. Okay. So that is the reason why the answer is B. Cause of the city, an initiative by a few businessmen promised to provide financial assistance of rupees 5,000 each month as a token of humanity to multiple economically backward families for a year. But after a few months, due to a pandemic, businessmen underwent huge losses, were unable to pay the families money. And since one of the families, on the belief that they will get the money every month, sat idle without working, and when the businessmen refused to pay them the money, they moved to the court requesting mandamus. Which of the following will be the likely result of the case? The answer is C, but why C and why not D? Because this is the more important one. The fact that this is not a government organization and mandamus can be issued only to the government. It cannot be issued to a private party. Writ is only for to enforce against the state, not against private parties. Okay, that is why C is your answer. 73. This is an easy question. 73. In view of the arguments made by the author, is the state government correct in setting aside the court order to collect data in order to provide more reservations? Yes. D is your answer. Okay. This is not true. So state government is not true, yes, but between no answers, these two, it will be, this is the better answer. D is your answer. And in fact, in this second question, this and this don't go together. Can we move on to the next passage? Okay. Okay, go through the second passage. Again, let's go through the passage. The questions will go together. You want me to read out the passage? Okay, fine. No problem. Temple entry for Dalits who had been barred on grounds of untouchability was one of the leading social reform movements that ran parallel to the larger independence movement in the early part of the last century in India. The first legal measure guaranteeing the rights of Dalits to enter temples at par with all other caste Hindus was the Temple Entry Proclamation issued by the then Maharaja of Travancore. It opened the doors of all temples in the princely state of Travancore to all classes of Hindus. Other states have followed since, and the Maharashtra Hindu Places of Worship Act is one of those laws protecting the rights of all classes of Hindus to access places of worship equally. Article 25(2)(b) of the Constitution of India clarifies that temple entry laws are not tantamount to restriction of individuals' right to religion under Article 25(1). So this article clarifies that if you're restricting entry to temple, it is not a restriction of right to religion. Okay. These laws have not gone unchallenged in court. Again, double negative, not gone unchallenged means they have been challenged in court. The Maharashtra Hindu Places of Worship Act was challenged in Bombay High Court by members of the Jain community, arguing that it did not apply to them since their temples were not open to Hindus generally, even though the definition of Hindus under the Act included Jain. The Bombay High Court upheld this contention, holding that Hindus couldn't enter a temple as a matter of right. So Dalit could also, therefore, not claim to enter the temple as a matter of right under the Bombay Act. I hope you understood this, incident over here, this judgment over here. Jains had a temple which they were not allowing. So why not only Dalits, no Hindu could enter. So there is no discrimination for Dalits, especially in this. That's why this act did not apply to them. This act was that all classes of people can enter. There's no restriction based on Dalits cannot enter and all that kind of thing. But this particular temple, this is a Jain temple managed by the Jain community, and their temple, they don't open it to Hindus also. They only open it to Jains. So if you're restricting all Hindus, then by not allowing Dalits to enter, it is not a violation of this particular act. That's what they're claiming. Did this necessarily mean that as long as a temple was set up by a given denomination, it could ignore all temple entry laws? The Constitution protects both an individual right to religion under Article 25 and a denominational right to manage its own religious affairs under Article 26. So an argument could be made that temple entry laws won't affect a temple used exclusively by a given denomination. Now in Venkatramana Devaru versus State of Mysore, a challenge raised by a temple meant for god Saraswat Brahmins in the coastal regions of then Mysore state, the Supreme Court clarified that temple entry laws would also apply to such so-called denominational temples. So if there are specific temples, it doesn't apply according to the earlier judgment, but in this case, they're saying it does apply. It read the permission to make temple entry laws contained in Article 25 to be applicable as a limitation on the rights of denominations of a religion to manage their own affairs, including running of temples. Shorn of all the legal and religious construction, the justifications offered for denying women entry into places of worship rests on a supposed inferiority of women in matters of religion. Whether such an argument is linked to menstruation, the weakness of physical frame, or some other physical attribute of women, the fact remains that arguments offered for restricting women's entry to religious places is a brute exercise of patriarchal power and nothing more. So what is the author saying? That if you are restricting women, whatever be the reasons by which you're doing it, it is a brute exercise of patriarchal power. Patriarchal power means the supremacy of the male, saying that only males are allowed, females should not be allowed, they're inferior and things like that. That is what this means. Male dominance. Yes. So let's look at the questions over here. A small but well-known religion denied entry to forward caste people and claimed that temple entry laws won't affect this temple as it has been used exclusively by a given denomination since time immemorial. If the aggrieved party moved to court disputing denial of entry, what would be the result of the case? Will the temple win or petitioner will win? Based on the two cases over here, the latter case is the Venkatramana case, and based on that, the petitioner would win the case. Okay, because of what was told in this case, he would win the case. Because this case has, this judgment is there, right? Based on this judgment, that will override the right of this person. Temple will not win the case. the petitioner will win the case. 75. The 1,000-year Sakartapur temple has been sanctified shrine of religion, and it denied entry to women for purely religious reasons. If a person was denied entry into the temple, she moved to the court contending her rights granted under Article 26. Which of the following would likely be the result of the suit based on the argument put forth by the author? What will the court say? Based on what is the arguments of the author? According to the author, the court has to grant entry, yes, A. Okay, that's a straightforward one. Fatima, devout follower of Islam, longed to enter a mosque but has been deferring to take action. On one fine day, when Fatima tried entering Hajj Ali Dargah, she was denied from entering the Dargah on the grounds that she is a woman. Aggrieved by the inequality, she moved the court challenging that her denial is violative of Article 25(2)(b). Would the court come to her relief and grant her permission to enter the Dargah? Yes, this article talks about only temples, not about other religious shrines. So this case does not come under this at all. Okay. So here this is a fine print. The law is there, but it only talks about temples, not about other things. Based on the decision of Bombay High Court, if Sikhism falls under the definition of Hinduism, and if no non-Sikh has been allowed entry into the temple generally, what would the court's decision on the entry or denial of non-Sikhs into the temple? In this case, it would be A. The Sikhs, they can get an order in their favor. Court will ban non-Sikhs because as a practice, they don't allow others to get into the temple. And this falls under Hinduism. Sikhs are not allowed into this temple. As a rule, Sikhism, they don't allow anybody who is not a Sikh to enter the temple. So this will be, even in this case, they will not allow, because what is the point? (78) If a petition is filed on the ground that one's right to practicing religion was curbed by the state, and if the state argues that temple entry laws are not tantamount to restriction of individuals' right to religion under Article 75(1), which of the following, if true, would strengthen the claim of the petitioner? So you want to file a petition saying that right to practice the religion has been curbed, and state says that temple entry laws are not the same as restriction of individuals' right. That's what is given over there also. But which of these will actually strengthen the claim of the petitioner? In what situation? If you can link, they are saying that these two are not connected, right? The state's argument is temple entry is not connected with individual's right. But if your intrinsic part of practicing your religion is to enter temple, that kind of thing, then it will be a big reason or a strong argument to fight against the curbing by the state. Is it clear? 78 one? Yes. Good. Which of the following is the author of the given passage most likely to agree with? This is too general. This is also too extreme. This is not true. So A is your answer. Okay. So though this passage on the face of it looks very easy, but there is a lot of scope for making mistakes in this. This is very far off statement, right? You want to take the country into utopia, so you have to remove all barriers kind of thing. A is your answer. Srilata, is it clear? Because this is too broad and general. Okay. Okay, let's now move on to the third passage. The occupier, I'll continue doing the same way. Is it convenient for all? I'll read it out instead of giving separate time. Okay. The Occupier Liability Act mandates that an occupier owes a duty of care in respect to dangers due to the state of the premises or to things done or omitted to be done on them. The common duty of care under the Act is a duty to take such care as in all circumstances of the case is reasonable to see that a visitor will be reasonably safe in using the premises for the purposes for which he is invited or permitted by the occupier to be there. Therefore, in determining a breach of duty, regard would be given to the degree of care and the required standard of care as employed in negligent claim. So basically, this is talking about your negligence and what is your duty of care that is required. The provisions enacted apply to regulate the obligations of a person occupying or having control over any fixed or movable structure, including any vessel, vehicle, or aircraft. Under the statute, the obligations of an occupier extend beyond a duty not to cause personal injury to a visitor and cover damage to property suffered on the premises, whether the property be that of the visitor or of a person who is not himself a visitor. The liability under the Act may also arise with respect to omissions. So basically, they should not cause any personal injury to a persons who are entering into their property. The Act categorizes plaintiffs as now people who are entering can be visitors and trespassers. Who is a visitor? Visitor is someone who is in the premises by invitation or permission to enter the premises. The permission can be either implied or expressed. Either it is given explicitly, which is expressed, or it can be implied. Implied is by not saying no, you're allowing permission. This permission is usually limited to some repairing jobs. By restricting the permission, the occupier can restrict the duty of care owed to the visitor. By giving limited permission, you are limiting the duty of care. The occupier can change the permission to a visit anytime. However, it needs to be shown very obviously to the visitor. A trespasser is a person who enters the premises of another without his or her consent. Somebody entering without permission or consent is a trespasser. However, if the occupier did not object to the entry of others on the land, then it is assumed that he had consented for the same. If you are not objecting when somebody is entering, then it means that you are giving your consent. The occupier is not expected to make his premises safe for the trespassers. For trespassers, you don't need to keep it safe. However, he cannot deliberately do an act to injure the trespasser. Having said that, he can't do anything on his land which will injure anybody who enters by mistake or without permission. The occupier has the right to take reasonable steps to prevent trespassers from entering the premises, but he cannot do any harm to them. This is a standard thing which you're all familiar with. So now let's look at the questions. A visitor to a park got hit by a golf ball that was hit into the park from a rooftop golf practice court, which wasn't due to start operations until after 3 months, which the owners of the park were well aware of. Aggrieved by the injury, the, the injured moved to the court suing the administrators of the park for negligence. Which of the following would likely be the outcome of the case? This is a question where very few people got it right, or rather the accuracy is less than 20%. In this case, there is a park and nearby there is a golf practice court which was not supposed to start till 3 months. Park people knew that till 3 months this golf will not start. During that time, somebody entered the park and that person got injured by a golf ball that came from there. Now what will happen when this guy goes to court asking the park people for saying the park people are negligent? Firstly, are the administration of the park negligent? They were not negligent. They were not negligent, yes. So obviously they would win. Now between B and D, which is right? Visitors entering the park didn't. That is not true. So D is your answer. They were not aware of the risk involved by allowing visitors. As far as they are concerned, there's no risk. Why? Because though there is a rooftop golf practice court, they are not supposed to start till 3 months. So they did not expect any risk at this point of time. So D is your answer. Straightforward question, easy. Now I don't know why people got confused. Anybody who got it wrong? There is no notice because it is not expected. The notice is not there because they didn't expect. This is an accident, pure accident. It's not because of the negligence of the administrator. It is the negligence of the rooftop practice court people. It's not the park's fault in any manner. Oh, it wasn't due to start until after 3 months. Yes. Okay. Fine. I hope it's clear now. It's a very easy question actually. Next one. Answer is marked as B in the explanation. It can't be B. If at all it is marked B, then it is a mistake. Okay. I'll check it up later, but there's no way it can be B. Visitors entering the park is expected. So definitely it can't be B. It will be D only, yes. A ladder fell off on a visitor to a supermarket who, after spending 20 minutes in the store, decided not to buy anything. If the visitor filed a suit of damages in the court, would the court grant an award in his favor? Yes. Because even though that person is only a visitor, he did not buy anything, still he is a visitor. And for a visitor, they have to take precautions. So D is your answer. Sorry. Srila owes a piece of land which was used by the public as a shortcut from and to the railway station. She objected to this practice, but had never taken effective action. So she did not really stop them. She didn't like it, but she didn't stop them. The victim, while crossing the field, was injured by a horse which was owned by Srila, who contended that the victim here was a trespasser and therefore she had no duty against him. If the victim moved to the court, which of the following parties would likely win the case? Please understand, moral obligation is never an answer. We are not worried about moral, we are only worried about legal liability. Okay. Now, victim would win. Why? Because she had not taken effective action for a long time, implied permission is there and this person now becomes a visitor. Okay. Very clearly it is given over here in the passage that if the occupier did not object to the entry of others on the land, it is assumed that he had consented for the same. Her objections were very weak. Her objections were not strong because she did not take any effective action for a long time. So that's why they become visitors. That is why the reason is B. Answer is B. Okay. 83. What if in the same scenario, two trespassers were moving through the passage, one of them got hit by a horse bought by the other person, other trespasser. In this case, what happens? Against whom must she file the complaint? It would be against the other trespasser because that person is the owner of the horse. Because Srila will not be responsible for that. Okay. A 3 or again this slight scope for confusion over here, but the answer is B. 84, easy question. Child in the zoo got accidentally injured by putting his hands through the iron bars. Tigress was being fed by the visitors. As soon as it smelled the hand, Tigress mauled the kid's hand. As soon as the incident happened, zoo authorities have put an iron mesh on the rods to prevent anyone from putting their hands. Parents moved to a court. Which of the following would be the likely? What would the court say? The court says zoo authorities are liable because they should have done this before itself, right? 85. Harrow Council owned, occupied and managed a public park which also had a lake. The lake had sandy beaches and was a popular recreational venue where matching sub-aqua diving and other activities were permitted except for swimming, and no swimming sign was posted at the entrance explicitly. The claimant took a dive with careful precautions which led him to strike his head on the sandy bottom. Aggrieved by the lack of conventional build of a swimming pool which was mandated by the Swimming Pool Act of India for professional swimming pools, the injured moved a suit against Harrow Council. Which of the following is a likely result? What is the case? He's moved a suit that they have not provided the facilities, what is required for a swimming pool. But is this a swimming pool? They have said clearly there is no swimming allowed. So obviously they don't have obligations to make it safe for swimming. So that is the reason A is your answer. Somebody said B. Is it clear why it is not B? It's why it's A, because the question is about Harrow Council and they have put up a sign for no swimming. That is the reason why they cannot be held liable. Is it clear? All those who said B, is it clear why A is the answer? Good. Let's move on then. Third passage or fourth passage. Section 12 of the arbitration and okay, fine. No problem. Section 12 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996 was recently amended in purview of neutrality of arbitrators and discussed the importance of the impartiality and independence of the arbitrators. The amended Section 12 of the Act laid down that, notwithstanding any prior agreement to the contrary, any person whose relationship with the parties or counsel or the subject matter of the dispute came within the purview of any of the classifications prescribed in the 7th schedule would be ineligible to be appointed as an arbitrator. The test laid down to determine the eligibility of an arbitrator to adjudicate upon a particular dispute was upheld in TRF Limited versus Energo Engineering Products Limited. We'll refer to this TRF judgment. The facts therein were that the managing director of one of the parties had not only been named as arbitrator, but was also given the unilateral power to nominate any other person as arbitrator. Upon hearing the parties, the Supreme Court was pleased to hold that an arbitrator who is ineligible by operation of law cannot nominate another as an arbitrator. In light of the TRF judgment, the mandate of the sole arbitrators had de jure terminated. However, despite this clear finding by Supreme Court, several high courts gave contradictory judgments on the basis of their interpretation of the TRF judgment and went on to hold that the concerned arbitration clauses in the said agreements were indeed valid. This led to an ambiguity as to whether an MD was ineligible to appoint an arbitrator or not. However, much to the respite of all litigants, recently the Supreme Court, through one of its latest and landmark judgments, the Perkins, has taken forward the TRF judgment and essentially bridged the gap that the TRF judgment fell short in doing. Vide this judgment, the Supreme Court had the opportunity to adjudicate upon a matter where the arbitration clause only empowered the MD of the concerned party to appoint an arbitrator of his choice. It is relevant to highlight that this arbitration clause was slightly different from the clause that was referred to in the TRF judgment, wherein the MD was not only vested with the power to unilaterally appoint an arbitrator, but was also nominated as an arbitrator. Therefore, Perkins removes any kind of ambiguity possible and directly addresses a very pertinent issue and also puts to rest all the various interpretations that were given by various high courts. A person who is vested in the outcome of the concerned proceedings cannot be eligible to appoint a person to adjudicate the same. So if you have it's more like your, if you have an interest in the case, you cannot be a judge. A person cannot be a judge in his own cause. Such appointment shall only lead to a high possibility of arbitrary findings and would therefore fail the test of fairness and impartiality. Now, this passage is not very difficult, but the challenge with this kind of passage is that it is not a known concept that you can immediately relate to it, because and some of the terms are lengthy, because of which there is a slight hesitation in taking up this. Is it right or no? But actually it is not very complicated, but I can understand very well if you have not taken this up in the entire set, if you have left this passage, that is understandable. Because why will that will happen is because it's not, you have a lot of unfamiliar terms, more scope for mistakes, or it will take you longer to get it right. So you will do this in the end. This is not something for you to take up immediately because a lot of jargon involved. As per the above passage, which of the following, but when you see the questions, you'll understand it's actually simple. Which of the following regarding section 12 is true? All are true statements. Which of the following are true regarding the Supreme Court judgment in the TRF case? Again, all these are true. We have said earlier, right? So whenever there is 3 statements and a fourth says all the above, if you get at least 2 correct, then you can go with that. what was upheld in the case of, and also bear in mind, you see the first statement that is true, please don't go mark until you see whether there is an all the above option also. Don't answer blindly. What was upheld in the case of Perkins case? What was said? '88, the answer is C. This is what was told, right? In the Perkins judgment, this statement has come. This is another question where many people got it wrong. This did not happen in the Perkins case at all. Did the judgment say that MD can not only unilaterally, he can also be an arbitrator? Obviously, he has not said that, no? Did the court say that? The court did not say that. Okay. 89. So as I was saying, 88, many people got it wrong. Don't get carried away whenever you see this kind of thing and mark it right. Please don't do that. Be cautious. Sometimes you will have traps. Are the arbitration clauses under dispute between the two cases same? Are they exactly the same? What is different? It is clearly given that they are slightly different. The second one is different, that in the TRF it was there that MD can not only be an arbitrator but also appoint an arbitrator. In the Perkins case, it only empowered MD to appoint an arbitrator. So that was the difference. B. Again, this is given straightforward from the passage, it's given there. What is the meaning of de jure used in the passage? By the law. Yes. Now also understand that sometimes you might not pick up this kind of a passage because it is difficult, but do look at the passage. Sometimes you might find questions which you can answer even without reading the entire passage or doing it, right? Now, I hope you have also now understood that though this passage looked a little difficult and complicated, the questions are all straightforward. So if you had taken it up, yes, you would have got them right. Only thing is it would have taken you more time to get these questions right. So then in that context, you will wonder, is it worth doing this particular passage? Maybe you would have had time to do 2 more other passages in the same time. Okay, next one. 91 to 95. This is no pregnancy clause in a film contracts. Prohibits an actress from getting pregnant until completion of the principal photography of the film. A breach which leads to the dismissal of the actress and or a claim for damages. The inclusion of such a clause is attributed to the difficulty associated with shooting complicated scenes with the pregnant actress due to health concerns, the expansion of midriff of the actress upon pregnancy, which is seldom in accordance with the script, and the disturbance in the shooting schedule because of unavailability of the actress on the agreed dates, leading to financial losses for the producer. So the reasons why this clause is introduced is given here. Now, as far as labor law is concerned, it is likely that an NPC will be invalidated by the non-derogatory provisions of the Maternity Benefits Act. Under the Indian Contract Act, read in light of jurisprudence on fundamental rights and Maternity Benefits Act, these clauses can also be said to be against the public policy of India and hence invalid. So the author says that these should be invalid. However, it can be argued that pregnancy would result in substantial non-performance of the fixed term film contract, thereby allowing for repudiation of the contract by the counterparty. What is repudiation? Going back. Repudiation is going back on the contract. In effect, what happens by going back? It leads to termination of the employment. The producer is not saying that the actress employment is terminated All that they are doing is that this contract is closed. With the contract being taken back, automatically this will lead to termination. The clause is arguably in violation of Articles 14, 15, 16 and 21 of the Indian Constitution. Unless the peculiar features of the film industry with the business of production houses dependent on the continuation of employment of the actress might persuade the Indian courts in holding NPC as a valid classification instead of a discrimination only on the basis of sex. International Labour Organization's Discrimination Convention 1958, which India ratified in June 1960, would make India liable for non-introduction of laws with respect to non-discrimination on the basis of sex in all forms of employment at the international level. However, India hasn't yet introduced a law implementing this convention at the national level. So there's no law in India at this point of time. It will also be helpful if the Film Guild Association takes lead in formulating guidelines in this respect. With respect to the position in this regard elsewhere in the world, where the jurisdiction in the US indicates that an NPC would fall within the BFOQ exception under the Title 7 of Civil Rights Act of 1964, the European Court of Justice is likely to construe this clause as that of promoting discrimination on the basis of sex. On the whole, there is no conclusive answer to the legal validity of these clauses. Though this passage is also about things which are not familiar, but at the same time it's easy reading. It's not difficult to read. As per which of the following laws laid down is a no pregnancy clause against the law? In all these, if you go by all these, it is against the law. Yes, easy. According to the author, what can be the best argument from the producers for including the... So what would the producers, which argument would they use according to the author? In what situations would it be valid? This is clearly given here. Pregnancy would result in substantial non-performance of the fixed term film contract. Now, let me explain what is... But a lot of people have got confused between C and A. The difference is C is more if it loses the postponement of release date, causes loss and all these things. It's more of a moral aspect, right? This is more related to their contract. If you go take the, how do you call, the moral angle out of it and purely look at it from a contract perspective. A contract is a fixed term. This is in the particular case of a film, it's a fixed term contract. Is she able to do that job? No, she's not. She will not be able to do that job during that time. That is the reason why the contract will not be valid, and hence, so A is your answer over here because it is going more in line with the legal aspects of that particular contract. This is about some other aspects, which is also true statement, no doubt about it. In fact, even this is a true statement per se, but that's not an answer. Okay. It will not hold in the court. 93. Based on the information in the passage, what do you conclude about the legal validity? Last paragraph is very clear. You cannot actually determine. This is only within US. In the UK, in the Europe, they say that it is discrimination, it cannot be valid. And in US, they say it is valid. So finally, it cannot be determined. 94, many people have got it right. Clearly, yes. Most people who attempted it have got it right. Which of the following contentions is put forth by the author with respect to sex determination in India? Yes. As per NPC, if there is a termination, then it leads, that is what is the author is saying. Okay. Others, through elimination, you can clearly answer this question 95, right? So again, this was an easy thing to do. Let's look at next passage. This is about complicity and constructive liability. Two principles most commonly used in criminal law. Complicity is the act of helping or encouraging being compliant. Complicity is nothing but being compliant or agreeing to and abetting, helping, that kind of thing. Helping or encouraging another individual to commit a crime. It's also commonly referred to as aiding and abetting. Abetment means helping, aiding, facilitating, and assisting. One who is complicit is said to be an accomplice. But even though an accomplice does not actually commit the crime, his or her actions helped someone in the commission of the crime. The doctrine serves to punish individuals who have played a distinct role in the commission of an offense without regard to whether they were or were not actually or constructively present at the time the crime were committed. The doctrine is followed to impute liability upon abettors, secondary offenders, accessories before and after the offense. So here it is not important that the person has to be there at the scene of crime for the complicity to apply. Constructive liability is also called joint liability. We are more familiar with this term. According to this, if two or more persons committed an offense jointly in furtherance of common intention, each of them would be held liable as if he had done it individually. Liability for abetment is determined under this principle. That is, the punishment of abetment is determined keeping this principle in view, since in abetment the mens rea of the one person has translated in the actus reus of another. So one person acts, but they are doing it on behalf of everybody. So it leads to it is considered that the other person also has done it because the intention is the same. Section 34 embodies the principle of joint liability in the doing of a criminal act. And the essence of that liability is the existence of the common intention and participation in the commission of the offense in furtherance of the common intention. That invites the application of the section. To apply section 34, the persons must be physically present at the actual commission of the crime. Thus, again, even in regard to an offense involving physical violence, it is not necessary that every accused must take an active part in the attack on the victim. One of the classic examples for section 34 is the case of Emperor versus Barendra Kumar Ghosh. In this case, the accused Barendra with other three persons went to Shankaritola post office before the sub postmaster was counting the money on the table and demanded the money. When he refused, they fired twice and it immediately resulted in the death. The assailants fled without taking any money but got arrested. The plea taken by Barendra Kumar Ghosh was that he was only carrying a pistol, did not fire. However, he was held to be liable considering the act done by him was done in furtherance of a common intention. Now, this is a small passage comparatively, and it's about two concepts. So, because the concepts are familiar, this becomes a passage that can be done easily. A father and son had trespassed into the house of H with the object of killing D, and H met with death at the shot of the father. Will the principle of joint liability apply in this case to make both father and son liable? This is again a question where many people got it wrong. Accuracy rate is less. Now, their object was to kill D. And who was killed? H. Now, in this case, do we know the father killed H? Can the son, the question is, will the joint liability, so what is important for joint liability? The common intention is important, right? Is the common intention available there? What was the common intention for? The common intention was for killing D. Yes. Can you say that there is common intent? This action was done for the common intention. Do you have that shown anywhere? It is not, there's not enough information to conclude that killing H was in furtherance of the common intention of killing D, right? So that is the reason you would go with A. Okay, clear? Why it is A? Because common intention of killing H is not, the common intention was for killing D, not for killing H. In the process, H got killed by the father. But was it in the purpose for fulfilling the common intention or for some other reason? We don't know. So you can't hold the son liable with that information. Just because he is present there doesn't make him liable, unless there is an intention. Is it clear, Srilata? Good. Next question, 97. A police had gone to arrest A at his home. B, C, and D were also present. When all three persons saw police coming, they came out to the house, gave a blow to the police, and drove them away. Will B, C, D also be held liable alongside A as per the principle of joint liability? Yes, in this case, why were they doing this? Why were they shooing away the police? Because they wanted to protect A, and with his intention, they all had a common intention. So all will be joint liability applies in this case. Common intention. 98. The complainant party was attacked by the accused, as a result of which one person died. The witness stated 3 persons were assaulting the deceased and the 4th person was simply standing holding a knife in his hand. Will the 4th person who was holding the knife be liable under the principle of joint liability? Again, this is a question where many people got it wrong. Percentage accuracy wise, a lot of people got it wrong, if you see. We don't know, again, in this case also, whether intention is there or not. So C is your answer and not D. For joint liability, intention is required. For joint liability, intention is required. If you are using the other, if the question was about the principle of complicity, maybe, but not for joint liability. The question is about joint liability. Which principle is laid down under section 34? Section 34 is about, it's a straightforward question, direct question. It's about joint liability and constructive liability, 1 and 2. Both are the same. Both joint liability and constructive liability are the same. So that's why it is A. And what is the difference between these two? Common intention is required for this one, and for this you don't need, they don't need to be doing together. This person, the presence of the person is not required in the second one. They are doing some action together, and in that process, if something goes wrong, principle of complicity applies. Okay, so A is your answer. Okay, the last passage. This is on the migrants issue. It's a matter of relief that the Supreme Court has at last taken cognizance of the plight of millions of interstate workers looking for transport home and relief from the unrelenting misery unleashed on them by the lockdown. A 3-judge bench has initiated Suo proceedings based on media reports and representations from senior advocates, observing that there have been inadequacies and lapses on the part of the center and states in dealing with the crisis faced by workers. This could have taken place 7 or 8 weeks earlier when petitions were filed before the top court on behalf of those left in the lurch across India after the center announced a lockdown with just 4 hours notice. With a kind of self-effacement and self-abnegation not in keeping with its institutional history, the court had then accepted the government's sweeping claim that there were no migrants on the roads anymore and that the initial exodus of workers from cities to their home states had been set off by fake news to the effect that the lockdown would last for months. In an unfortunately limited intervention, the court merely advised the police to treat the workers on the roads with kindness and directed the media to highlight the center's version of the developments. This is the previous time when the petitions were filed a few weeks earlier, right? 7 or 8 weeks earlier case this is all about. The court's reluctance to intervene may have stemmed from a belief in letting the executive handle the fallout of an unprecedented global crisis. But in the process, it abandoned its primary responsibility of protecting fundamental rights, especially of those most vulnerable. Such was the resultant dismay that retired judges called it out for apparent abdication of its duty. A former High Court judge even said the ghost of ADM Jabalpur was lingering in an unflattering reference to an emergency era judgment, now mercifully overruled, that held that personal liberty was not absolute during a state of emergency. Whether it was shamed into taking cognizance of the issue or it felt that the situation is ripe for intervention, one should now expect the court to take a more critical look at the government's lapses and emulate the stellar role that the high courts are playing in holding administrations accountable. So basically, the author is saying the high courts are doing a better job than the Supreme Court. The top court must now find out if the center, which imposed a stringent lockdown to buy time for preparing the health infrastructure, had discharged its responsibilities. It may even lay down guidelines for planning, coordination, and establishment of a mechanism to address the economic and humanitarian consequences of such actions in future. The government should also do more than asking its law officers to fulminate against activists, denounce the media, and question the patriotism of those critical of its actions. A national tragedy requires a more statesman-like response. So basically, the author is criticizing the actions of the government. This is not... Okay, 101. Which of the following is the most apt description of the word suo motu proceedings? Even if you did not have time, I think this is one question which you should have answered. Proceedings initiated without the petitions being filed. Suo motu is on its own motion. So not because of a petition. Pen is not working, don't worry. Just answer is D, 101. When petitions were filed by the migrant persons earlier, what did the judge say? Judgment. What was the earlier judgment? They only said that the police should show humane behavior and media should circulate the stand of the government. So they should curb fake news, those kind of things. C is your answer. Earlier case, that was what the judgment was by the Supreme Court. Why was the court unwilling to intervene? According to the author, because the Supreme Court thought they wanted the government to handle the outcomes without any interference from the courts. So that's why the author says it's given in the passage, right? The reluctance to intervene may have stemmed from a belief in letting the executive handle the fallout of an unprecedented global crisis. Okay, that is the reason why they did not interfere earlier. C. 104. According to the author, why did the government impose strict lockdown? The author feels that it's because they thought He thought the government will get sufficient time to prepare the healthcare infrastructure required. 105, author expects Supreme Court to provide a ruling in which of the following aspects? Clearly given, C. One, sorry, 105 is all. All are given. All have been specified, right? The government should do more, denounce the media, and what is that? The crop course must now find out if the center had discharged its responsibilities, lay down guidelines, and should do more than asking its officers to do this. So all are there. Now the question 104, why not C? Why not D, right? According to the author, why did the government impose a strict lockdown? Where is it given? The top court must now find out if the center which imposed a stringent lockdown to buy time for preparing the healthcare infrastructure. That's what the author believes. The author believes it is for preparing the healthcare infrastructure. And the question is about what does the author believe? That is why it is C and not D. All direct questions. Yes, this passage had all direct questions and it is given last. So the chances are that you may not have time when you come to this. Sometimes it will happen like that you might have easy passages at the end. So don't rule out, don't always go in a sequential. The 35 minutes, spend 2 or 3 minutes in the beginning trying to figure out which order to pick up the passages. By doing easy passages first, you can finish it fast and also boost your confidence. What happens is if the first 1 or 2 passages that you take up in the legal section are difficult, you might tend to lose your concentration towards for the rest of the passages. So try to avoid that kind of situation by picking up an easy passage first. So try and pick up passages which are based on the concepts that you know. Do that first, then move on to other things which are unknown. Try out this in the next mock. Anybody else has questions? Obviously, yes, it will help. Do the rank booster books. Take all the rank booster mocks seriously and analyze. If you do all these, definitely your errors will be reduced. Anybody else has questions? If not, we can wind up today's session. For improving effective reading, I think the best is to keep reading editorials. Apart from solving all these things, do read articles. Those of you who have not been attending my sessions so far, I've been telling, please, for the best way to prepare for this year's CLAT is to read as many articles as possible. Build your speed in reading by doing more reading. So try and read a lot of legal articles, editorials, legal websites. That will definitely help you. You can suggest read India Legal, then you have Live Law, There are multiple legal websites. So you can try some of those. Bar and Bench. Some of these will have explainer articles also. So try and go through them. Then what happens? See, the more wider your knowledge base, you don't need depth of knowledge. Please understand, you don't need depth of knowledge. You don't need to memorize any of these things. Just that familiarity with some of these topics, and your familiarity should be obtained at a slow pace. Because now when you're reading articles, you're not pressed for time. When you're doing a mock, you're pressed for time. So try reading articles in a slower time. Rank booster books available, you need daily schedule. Come on, set a time limit and do every day one passage in each. There are around 30 passages in each. Daily pick up one and do one in each of these areas. If you already done this book, please go ahead and do the passages that have been discussed in all the classes before. Sanjana, what is your question? You're not able to attempt. It's a very generic statement. What do you want me to say? You have anything specific? I can tell you. Listen to all the lectures again online. Maybe that should give you some more. How to go through what? In the student portal, yes, all the lectures that have happened in the last 2 months is available. So if you're not having access, please talk to the to Sampath and obtain that access. And then if you practice those exercises, definitely it will. Silita, your question is regarding the average of mocks. Definitely there's a lot of scope. If that average is for the legal score, definitely you need to work on that a little more. You need to improve further, because it's there's a lot of scope. You should be able to get at least around 25 or more than that. So try and do it every mock. Change your strategy. Do some old mocks between the week. Do an older mock once more. Try it out. Okay, your question, you don't have time to attempt reveal. I think what you need to do is the way you manage your time is to set time. One is don't try doing legal at the last. If you do legal at the end, definitely you cannot do it, and you're not doing justice to it. So try and plan legal somewhere in between. Okay. You have 3 sections which have more reading to do: English, legal, and logical. And there are 2 sections which require lesser time. One is QT, Quant, and the other is GK. GK has more questions and requires less time. Quant has less question. If you do it seriously, all questions, then definitely it will take more time. But you should not use that time. Don't spend more than 10 to 15 minutes max for the QT section. If you are spending more than that in the quant section, you'll not have. It's not worth spending more than that. Whatever you can do, just do a hard stop after 12 to 15 minutes. Just stop that section, and don't do that in the beginning. Try and do somewhere in between. Okay, but not more than 15. For both of those sections, they don't need more than 15 minutes. Then only you will get time for legal. If you're trying to do legal at the end, obviously you will not have enough time and you will be finishing. So try and see, those of you who are struggling with legal, I would say out of 7 passages, try and do at least 4. Try and do at least 4 first, then increase your numbers. Logical and quant, time guzzlers. Okay, quant has only only 10%, 15 marks, 15 to 17 marks. So not worth spending more time. Similarly, logical is also a time guzzler, because you might get stuck in some of the puzzles. Puzzles will be taking up a lot of your time. You cannot waste so much time. Just put a hard stop after 20-25 minutes for the logical section. Just like I said for maths or QT, stop after 15 minutes. Same way, logical, stop after 20-25 minutes. Beyond 25 minutes, just hard stop, move on to another section. That's the only way you can do. Okay, if there are no more questions, we can leave. Anybody, others can leave. Those who have questions can stay back, and those who don't have questions can leave. I think a lot of people have already left, but even others. Yes. Puzzles will be tricky, yes, no doubt about it. See, you have to understand, there will be some questions which are only there to waste your time. Just like in the court, the lawyer might be putting in some arguments just to drag. You might yourself be trying that tactic at times, just to drag. But so what happens? The energy of the other party is gone in trying to, answer some very silly argument, and they don't have energy left for the main critical argument. Same way, in the exam also, there will be some questions which are there just to eat away your time. You should avoid falling into that trap. Learn how to ignore those questions and move on to the important sections or where you can get marks. Okay. Anybody else has questions? As I said, for GK, not more than 15 minutes. English, 20 to 25 minutes. English, if you see, it will take you lesser time than legal or logical, because the questions will be more straightforward. You should not use more than that. If for English you're stuck, you're needing more time than that, that means your reading speed is a problem. And if reading speed is a problem, focus every day 1 hour on reading. Read anything. Read a storybook, read news articles, read editorials, whatever. Just keep reading. Improve your speed in reading. Right. Okay, then we'll wind up for the day. So all the best. Do a detailed analysis of your mock. As I said, go and see. All explanations are given there. Go back and check. Okay. And all the best for the next ones. Bye.